My name is Nora Whittaker, and I'm 37. I read people the way most folks read a spreadsheet, and I've never once been wrong about a betrayal. This past spring, my mother called me sobbing so hard the words came out in pieces. Danielle needs an operation, she said. Please, you have to help her. I was at my desk, buried under audit paperwork, and in one sentence 11 years folded up on themselves. Because 11 years ago, those exact words came out of my own mouth. I was 26, dead broke, strapped into a rigid plastic back brace, begging my parents to release the money my grandmother had set aside for me so I could pay for spine surgery. They said no. They told me I'd figure it out somehow. Then they spent $142,000 on my sister's dream wedding. But nobody in that family saw two things coming. They never imagined the woman I'd grow into, and they had no idea about the cedar box sitting in my grandmother's attic. Before I get to what I finally said back to my mother, you need to know exactly what that $142,000 really bought. If your family ever decided you were the tough one just so they could hand your piece to somebody else, stick with me. Drop a comment below and go ahead and subscribe. I run a forensic accounting firm out of an old converted storefront in Indianapolis. 4 people on staff, 2 conference rooms, and a row of filing cabinets my office manager swears could outlast the building itself. My work is medical money. Clinics, surgery centers, small hospital groups, private practices. When a billing office loses track of $500,000, I'm the call they make. When a manager's been pocketing patient copays for years, I'm the one who spots the pattern buried in the data. That's the thing about numbers. They don't put on a show for the holidays. They don't hug you at Thanksgiving and then rob you blind by New Year's. My grandmother taught me that long before I understood what a balance sheet even was. Nana used to plant me on her kitchen floor in Muncie with a leather ledger older than my mom and walk me down the columns with a stubby pencil that had no eraser. Numbers don't lie, Nora, she'd say. People do. I was 7 the first time I heard it. I believed her back then, and I still believe her now. The firm is mine, top to bottom. I built it from nothing. No investors, no family loans, no favors called in. When I get up from my desk, I do it slow and on purpose because 11 years ago a surgeon fused 2 of the vertebrae in my lower back, and on cold mornings the metal in there lets me know it's still around. I move fine. I just move with intention, and I don't complain about any of it. That's a habit I learned early, keeping quiet. Being the daughter who handled her own problems, the one nobody ever had to worry about, almost cost me my ability to walk. But here's what happens when you're the silent one in a loud family. Sooner or later you learn that silence earns interest, and nobody sees the payout coming. Growing up, my parents had 2 girls. Danielle was older by 3 years. She had the face, the kind of laugh that made restaurant staff drift toward our table, a closet stuffed with dance trophies, and a senior portrait that still glows in my mother's hallway like a billboard. I had good report cards. I had a beat-up car I bought myself at 16 with money from mowing lawns. And I had Nana. My grandmother lived 20 minutes away in a little brick ranch that always smelled like cedar and old paper. While Danielle was off at cheer camp, and my parents planned their whole lives around her calendar, I'd pedal my bike over to Nana's and sit on her rug while she brought out the cedar box. That box was dark and heavy, about the size of a shoebox, with a brass latch that clicked twice when it opened. Inside sat the leather ledger, spine cracked, pages ruled, every line filled in with Nana's neat blue handwriting. She'd kept the books for a plumbing supply company for 28 years and retired with 0 fanfare, but to her those columns were scripture. She taught me debits and credits the way other grandmothers pass down a pie recipe. When I turned 12, Nana opened a custodial account with my name on it. A UTMA, she called it, set up so nobody could ever claw it back. This is for whatever comes next, she told me. School, a first apartment, whatever you end up needing. She fed it birthday cash, holiday checks, dividends from a little inheritance she'd gotten. The balance climbed year after year, and she logged every single deposit in that ledger, right beside my name. Then Nana died when I was 18. A heart attack on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I lost the one person who actually saw me. What I didn't understand yet was that I'd lose the money she saved too. 8 years after she passed, I was 26 and driving home from a temp job at a billing office out in Fishers when a pickup blew through a red light on State Road 37. The crash crushed my L4 and L5 and blew out the disc between them. I heard it before I felt it, this wet crunching sound, like stomping a rotten apple the size of a basketball. Then the pain showed up and never left. The ER doctor put the MRI on the screen and pointed to a white blur pushing into my spinal cord. "You need a fusion," he told me. "The sooner the better, or you're looking at nerve damage you don't come back from." The estimate landed at $61,000. I had barebones catastrophic coverage through the temp agency, a $9,500 deductible, and a network that didn't include the one spine surgeon within 50 miles willing to take my case. Best case out of pocket, I was looking at north of $45,000. I couldn't sit longer than 20 minutes. I couldn't stand up straight. The clinic handed me a hard back brace, white plastic and Velcro straps that bit into my ribs with every breath. I wore it under my clothes to job interviews. I wore it to Danielle's birthday dinner. I slept in it, because lying flat without it felt like somebody was twisting a screwdriver into my hip. I had $3,800 to my name. I was 26 and my spine was falling apart. But the money existed. Nana's account. The UTMA she'd fed for years. The one she promised me was mine. My parents were the custodians. All they had to do was sign a release. I called my mother on a Wednesday night and asked. Her voice went funny, the way it does when she's shuffling the facts around before she opens her mouth. "Sweetheart, that account," she said. "There's almost nothing in it anymore." I shifted in my chair and the brace groaned. "What do you mean, almost nothing?" "Well, there was your schooling and the fees and a few adjustments here and there." "Nana put money in that account for 7 straight years," I said. "Nora, your grandmother meant well, but toward the end she wasn't keeping the best records. Things got muddled. I'll dig into it, but don't get your hopes up." Then she switched to talking about Danielle's new drapes. I sat in the kitchen of my little studio. The phone jammed between my shoulder and my ear because I couldn't turn my neck, and I kept snagging on that word. Adjustments. I'd worked in billing long enough to know that when someone says adjustments without ever naming a figure, they're hiding the figure. But I was hurting. Real, blinding pain, the kind that shrinks your whole world down to the next hour and the next position that hurts a little less. So I didn't push. I told myself she'd look into it and call me back. She didn't call back. I called again a week later, still looking into it. The week after, the bank was giving her trouble. The week after that, she stopped picking up altogether. By then, my left foot was going numb for 10 minutes at a stretch, and the surgeon's office had called twice about scheduling. I was running out of time and running out of spine. And then, on the first Saturday in April, Danielle showed up at my parents' house with a 2.5-carat ring and a man named Kevin Marsh. And just like that, my mother's whole focus swung toward the only project that ever really mattered to her. The wedding planning kicked off that same week. My mother, Sharon Whittaker, had been waiting her entire adult life for this. She'd grown up poor in a 2-bedroom rental in Marion, hand-me-down furniture, a father who repaired refrigerators for a living. She married my dad, Frank, who ran an auto parts warehouse. They were comfortable, not rich, just comfortable. But my mother had always looked at Danielle and seen something brighter than what she'd been handed. Danielle was the do-over. Danielle was the daughter who'd marry up and throw the kind of party people talked about for years, the life my mother had been clipping out of magazines since the 80s. So when Danielle got engaged, my mother didn't plan a wedding. She built a shrine. The venue was a restored barn about 40 minutes outside the city, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a chandelier trucked in from a showroom down in Georgia. The florist flew in peonies from the Netherlands. The dress was custom. The caterer laid out a 6-course tasting menu for 165 guests. I know all this because my mother described it to me every time we spoke. Every time I called about the account. Every time I shifted in that brace and swallowed a groan so she wouldn't hear it. By then I was sleeping in a recliner because flat was no longer an option. The numbness had crawled up from my foot into my calf. I'd started using a cane when nobody was watching, and my mother was agonizing over Italian marble versus French limestone for the cocktail hour risers. The math wasn't complicated. 142,000 for a party, 0 for a surgery. Simple numbers, even simpler message. I drove out to my parents' place on a Sunday in May. Nobody invited me. They were doing menu tastings with the caterer, but I went anyway, because my surgeon had bumped my case to urgent and my left leg was giving out twice a day. I found my mother at the kitchen table surrounded by binder tabs color-coded by category. Ivory for linens, sage for the flowers, blush for the seating. I sat down across from her and just said it. "Mom, I need the surgery. The doctor says if I wait past June I could lose the use of my leg. The money's right there in Nana's account. I just need you to sign the release." She didn't lift her eyes off the binder. "We've already talked about this," she said. "You told me you'd look into it," I said. "That was 2 months ago." "Nora, the timing just isn't." "The timing is that my spine is collapsing," I said. She shut the binder and looked at me, and her face wore that expression I'd seen 1,000 times. The one where she'd already made up her mind, and the conversation was just a formality she was fast losing patience for. "Your sister is getting married in 4 months," she said. "Do you have any idea what that costs? Do you have the first clue what we're juggling right now?" "I'm asking about my account," I said, "the one Nana left me. Danielle needs it more than you do." The kitchen went silent. My dad was standing in the doorway with a glass of iced tea, staring at the floor. I waited for him to say a single word. He took a sip and turned back toward the garage. My mother reopened her binder to a fresh tab. "You're young," she said. "You're smart. You'll figure it out." And then she went back to her seating chart. I drove home in the brace. That was the last time I asked. Something shut off in me. Not a door, more like a valve. I didn't scream and I didn't cry in front of them. I went back to my apartment and built a spreadsheet. Every payment I could push back, every side gig I could grab, every credit card offering 0% for a while. I picked up a second weekend job running payroll for a construction outfit. I worked in the brace every day, standing at a desk I'd propped up on boxes, because sitting was a fight I kept losing. The wedding was in October. I went. I wore a navy dress that hid the brace and swallowed 3 ibuprofen before the ceremony. That barn looked like it had been lifted straight out of my mother's magazine clippings. Peonies in glass cylinders, candles on every flat surface, a string quartet playing something I'd never heard. 165 people eating duck confit and telling my mother she'd outdone herself. I stood in the back because the chairs sat too low for me. I watched my sister float down the aisle in a gown that cost more than a year of my rent. I watched my father raise a glass and talk about investing in your children's happiness. I watched my mother beam in a way she had never once beamed at me. The photographer got all of it. That one shot, Danielle and Kevin under the chandelier with the peonies framing them like a crown, ended up in a silver frame on my mother's mantel. It's still there. 11 years later, it's the very first thing you see when you walk through the door. It took me 2 years to scrape together enough for the surgery. It took me 11 to find out what they'd actually spent. I had the fusion at 28, a 4-hour operation at a hospital in Fort Wayne that agreed to a payment plan I'd spend the next 5 years chipping away at. The surgeon slid in 2 titanium rods and a cage between L4 and L5. When I woke up, the first thing I registered was the quiet. The fire that had been burning down my left leg for 2 years was just gone. Switched off, like a faucet I'd forgotten was still running. Recovery ran 4 months. Physical therapy 3 days a week in a place that smelled like rubber and antiseptic. I taught myself to walk without the cane. I taught myself to sit through an hour without eyeing the clock. The brace went in a closet, then in a box, then to the back of the box. The scar runs about 5 inches down my lower spine, a pale line like a seam sewn into fabric. I don't hide it. I don't flash it either. It's just there, Same as the hardware. Same as the memory that surfaces on cold mornings when I stand up too quick and feel the rod settle in. While I was healing, I finished my CPA. I'd been studying between shifts, between pain flare-ups. On the nights I sat in that recliner at 3 in the morning reading forensic accounting cases because I couldn't sleep and I needed to believe numbers could fix something. Turns out they can. I started taking contract work, auditing small practices that ran their whole billing on spreadsheets and good faith. I was good at it. I was patient. I could sit with 10,000 lines of data and find the single one that didn't fit. I kept my distance from the family, and not out of spite, out of math. By 30, I'd started Whitaker Medical Audit. One woman, one laptop, and a reputation for being thorough enough that clinics in 4 counties started calling before their insurance audits even landed. By 32, I'd hired my first employee. By 34, I had the storefront, 3 analysts, and a client list steady enough that I stopped chasing invoices. I didn't bring any of it up at family dinners because I'd stopped going to family dinners. I mailed birthday cards. I picked up when my dad called, which happened about twice a year. Always short, always the same lines. How's work? Fine. How's your mom? Fine. How's Danielle? Fine. Nobody ever asked about the surgery. Nobody asked about the payment plan I just finished. Nobody asked about the scar. I was the daughter who managed, and managing was treated like it cost nothing. The way people figure the lights come on because that's just what lights do. Nana would have asked. Nana would have opened the ledger, tapped a column, and said, "Show me the numbers, Nora. Show me what it took out of you." But Nana was gone, and the cedar box was wherever my mother had stashed the things she didn't consider useful. I thought about it now and then. The ledger, the account records, the columns in blue ink. I thought about calling the bank and asking for statements. But the account was custodial, and the custodians were my parents. Every time I tried to get information at 26, the bank had pointed me right back to them, so I moved on. I'd built something real. I told myself that was enough. If you're still paying off something a relative should have covered, I understand you completely. I paid mine down one sleepless night at a time. Hit subscribe because this next part is where the numbers start to speak up. Trust me, you'll want to hear what they say. Last March, my mother's voice punched through 11 years of careful distance like a rock through glass. "Nora, it's your sister." I was in the middle of a billing discrepancy for a dermatology group up in Carmel. I set down my pen. "What about her?" "Kevin left," she said. "She said it the way you'd announce a burst pipe. Sudden, costly, somebody else's fault entirely." The details trickled out over the next couple of calls. Kevin Marsh, Danielle's husband of 11 years, had been running a contracting business that turned out to be running on borrowed money. When the debts came due, Kevin didn't stick around. He moved into a furnished apartment down in Louisville and filed for divorce, leaving Danielle with a mortgaged house, 2 maxed-out credit cards, a 13-year-old daughter named Lily, and a herniated disc in her neck that her soon-to-be ex-husband's soon-to-be-canceled insurance wasn't going to cover. My mother laid it all out like a verdict she expected me to appeal on the spot. "She needs surgery, Nora," she said. "The doctor says the numbness in her hands is getting worse. She can't pay for it. She can't even afford the consultation." I let the quiet stretch. My mother has never been comfortable with quiet. "Are you still there?" "I'm here," I said. "Well, I'm thinking," I said. "What is there to think about? She's your sister." 3 days later, Aunt Janet called. Janet is my mother's younger sister, a retired dental hygienist from Anderson who runs unofficial communications for the whole family. She told me everybody was heartbroken. She told me Danielle was barely holding it together. She told me the family was really hoping I'd do the right thing. I thanked her for the call. I didn't promise a thing. I sat in my office, stared at the filing cabinets, and thought about a cedar box I hadn't laid eyes on in 17 years. 2 weeks after that, my mother called again, and this time the ask was different. "We're selling Nana's house." The brick ranch in Muncie had been sitting empty since my grandfather moved into assisted living 5 years back. My parents had been covering the taxes and mowing the grass and putting off the inevitable. Now they wanted the money out of it. There are boxes up in the attic with your name on them, she said. Old school stuff. Some of Nana's things she wanted you to have. If you want any of it, come get it before the estate sale. I said I'd drive down Saturday. I told myself it was only about the boxes. Yearbooks, maybe the watercolor set Nana gave me for my 10th birthday, maybe a couple of her kitchen things. I told myself I was going for closure, for the last piece of the one house that had felt safe when I was a kid. But under all the practical reasons and clean logic, there was a question I'd been hauling around for 11 years. A question shaped exactly like a bank statement. How much had actually been in that account? I know I could have fought harder at 26. I could have hired a lawyer, demanded records, pushed until something cracked. But I'd been in a brace. I'd been in pain. I'd been 26 and broke and outnumbered by the very people who were supposed to have my back. So I let it slide. I managed. And now my mother was handing me a reason to walk back into that house. The house where Nana kept her records, where the cedar box had lived on the top shelf of the hall closet, where the numbers were still waiting in blue ink for somebody who knew how to read them. I told myself I was only going for the boxes. Turned out I was right about the box. Just not the one I expected. The house smelled like dust and lavender sachets. Nana had tucked them into every closet, and somehow they'd outlasted her by 17 years. My mother was in the kitchen sorting dishes into keep and sell piles. My father was out in the garage doing whatever he does when my mother is in charge of something, which mostly means staying out of the line of fire. Danielle was in the living room, sitting on Nana's old sofa, scrolling her phone. She looked smaller than I remembered, thinner, her right hand resting on her neck in that careful way you hold something that hurts. She glanced up when I came in. Hey. That was the full extent of the warmth between us. On the wall behind her, next to Nana's landscape painting, hung the wedding photo. Silver frame. Danielle and Kevin under that chandelier, the imported peonies wrapped around them like they'd never in their lives run short on luck. Those flowers alone had to have run $7,500. I knew because I'd audited a floral wholesaler the year before and learned what Dutch imports cost when you need 200 stems in October. $7,500 in flowers, gone in a single night, still hanging on the wall. Danielle caught me staring. You always were counting something, she said. Occupational hazard, I said. She smiled, but there was a blade in it. Not everybody's cut out for the fairy tale, Nora. Some of us get it and then lose it. You'll be fine. You always are. Then she went back to her phone, and there it was. My mother's line passed down like a family heirloom, the assumption that I was built to survive and she was built to be rescued. I walked past her toward the stairs. The attic was one flight up, and 17 years of Nana's carefully labeled boxes were up there waiting in the dark. The attic was hot, the ceiling low, a single bulb dangling from a pulled chain. Boxes were everywhere. Christmas ornaments, old tax files, a sewing machine in a case. Back in the far corner, behind a stack of old Reader's Digest collections, I found a box marked Nora, Nana's things in my mother's handwriting. Inside were the watercolors, a tin full of buttons, Nana's reading glasses in a quilted sleeve, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a dish towel printed with cardinals, the cedar box. I knew it before my fingers even touched it. The brass latch clicked twice, the same as it always had. I opened it right there in the heat, and the smell of cedar and old paper hit me so hard I had to sit down on the floor. The leather ledger was inside. Cracked spine, blue ink. But underneath the ledger were papers I'd never seen before. A custodial account agreement. Uniform transfers to Miners Act. State of Indiana. Beneficiary, Nora Jean Whittaker. Custodians, Sharon Whittaker and Frank Whittaker. Opening balance, $3,900. Clipped behind the agreement, page after page in Nana's handwriting, was every deposit she'd ever made. Birthdays, Christmases, the quarterly dividends from her little inheritance. 7 years of entries. The last deposit, made 4 months before she died, brought the running total to $71,200. And below that total in Nana's steady hand, one line. For Nora, numbers don't lie. I sat on that attic floor with the ledger in my lap. the heat pressing down on me, my mother sorting dishes one floor below. And what I felt was colder than anger. What I felt was math. Because $71,000, with even modest growth over the 8 years between Nana's death and the day I begged for surgery money, should have been sitting well above 85,000. My mother had told me there was barely anything left. Numbers don't lie. People do. I carried the cedar box back to Indianapolis and kept it to myself. I told nobody. That night I laid the ledger and the account agreement flat on my dining table and studied them the way I study a client file when something refuses to add up, slow and unhurried, trusting that the answer is always sitting somewhere in the paperwork. The account number was printed right on the agreement. So were both custodian names. And there was my own name, the beneficiary, the person every dollar had legally belonged to from the second Nana wrote it down. At 26, I'd phoned the bank and been brushed off, told the custodians had to greenlight any release of information. Back then, I swallowed it. I was young, I was hurting, I didn't know what to argue. At 37, I knew exactly what to argue. As the named beneficiary of a UTMA account, and long past the age of majority, I had a flat legal right to a full accounting of every transaction. I also knew that a formal demand on my firm's letterhead, quoting Indiana's Transfer to Minors statute and attaching the original agreement, would land with a weight that a broke kid in a plastic brace could never generate. I wrote the letter on a Monday. I sent it certified on a Tuesday. I asked for the complete transaction history from the day the account opened to the day it closed. Every deposit, every withdrawal, dates, dollar amounts, and who authorized each one. I copied a colleague of mine who handles fiduciary law because I wanted whoever opened that envelope to grasp right away that this wasn't a family member pleading. This was a forensic accountant with the founding documents in hand. The bank's first answer showed up 9 days later, a single page. They confirmed the account had existed and had been closed. For detailed records on something shut down more than a decade back, they'd have to dig into archives, and they'd need either custodian sign-off or a court order. I'd figured as much. My colleague fired back a follow-up citing the statute, noting my standing as the beneficiary past majority, and mentioning politely that a subpoena would be on its way inside 10 business days if the records didn't turn up on their own. 3 days after that, the compliance department called. The archived files would take 2 to 3 weeks to pull, so I waited. I wasn't after revenge. I just wanted the columns to line up. 5 weeks after my first letter, a fat certified envelope hit my desk. I opened it that night after the last analyst had gone home, and the numbers started talking. The account had not been running on fumes when I asked for surgery money. It had held $86,900. Nana's deposits plus 6 years of steady growth on the index fund she'd chosen. Nearly $87,000. My mother had told me there was barely anything left. She told me it went to my schooling. She told me the records were a mess. The records were not a mess. They were spotless, because banks keep clean books and numbers stay clean. The only thing that had ever been muddled was the story my mother wrapped around them. The withdrawals kicked off in April, the same month Danielle got engaged. A couple in April, more in the summer, a big one in August, then the final draw that scraped the balance to nothing, dated the first week of October. The wedding was that same month. I laid the statements out across my desk and just looked at the dates. Spring through fall, engagement to reception. Almost $87,000 pulled out in a string of withdrawals over 6 months, everyone authorized by Sharon Whitaker, custodian. I've opened a lot of statements in my life. I usually know what I'll find before I look. This was not that. This was seeing my own name printed at the top of a ledger that somebody had drained while I lay in a recliner with a spine coming apart. I set Nana's leather ledger down beside the bank printout. Her deposits on the left in blue ink, the withdrawals on the right in machine print. 2 kinds of handwriting, and in the space between them, the whole frame of a lie that had held up for 11 years. I shut the ledger. I didn't cry. Crying doesn't balance an account. I picked up my phone and called a lawyer. The next morning, I chased down the vendor records, and it barely took any effort, because the statements did most of the lifting themselves. Every withdrawal listed the payee, the name on the check, or the wire. All I had to do was match those names to the wedding. My mother had kept her color-tabbed binder, the same one I'd watched her fuss over while I sat across from her in a back brace asking for money that was already mine. I didn't have the binder, but I had the invitation sweet Danielle had mailed to all 165 guests, me included, and I'd never had a reason to toss it. It was still in a drawer. I matched them one by one. The April withdrawal, the barn venue's deposit. Another April draw, the florist who imported the peonies' first payment. Summer, the caterer. August, the bridal boutique. Early October, the decor rental outfit. I set the payee names and dates against the withdrawal dates from my custodial account. They didn't just line up loosely. They matched exactly. Every dollar out of that account mapped, amount for amount and week for week, to a wedding bill. My surgery fund paid for the peonies. My surgery fund covered the chandelier, the duck confit, the limestone risers, the string quartet, and the silver frame still hanging over my mother's mantel. Nana had saved for 7 years so I'd have something to stand on. My mother had spent it in 6 months so Danielle could have 1 weekend. Numbers don't editorialize. They don't comfort you or spin you a reason. They just sit there, row after row, quiet and impossible to argue with, and they leave the decision to you. I decided. The attorney's name was Marcus Delaney. He worked fiduciary and estate law out of an office near Fountain Square with a window facing a brick wall and a filing system nearly as obsessive as mine. I brought the cedar box, the annotated statements, the wedding invitation, and the account agreement. I laid it all out on his desk in sequence, the gift, the growth, the theft, the proof. He read for 20 minutes without a word. Then he looked up and told me it was clean. Under Indiana law, he explained, a UTMA account is an irrevocable gift. The money had been mine from the moment Nana deposited it. As custodians, my parents held a fiduciary duty to spend those funds only for my benefit, things like education or medical care, whatever a careful custodian could reasonably justify. Bankrolling another child's wedding was nowhere on that list. It was a clean breach of fiduciary duty. It was conversion, the legal word for taking someone's property and treating it as your own. Marcus walked me through the road ahead. A formal demand for repayment first. If they refused, a civil complaint for breach of fiduciary duty, conversion, and a full accounting. He was straight with me about the possible outcomes. A judge might hand back only the principal, or the principal plus statutory interest, or in the best version, whatever the money would have grown to if it had stayed invested. Nothing at trial is a lock, but he'd handled enough of these to know the paper trail itself was leverage. Custodians caught with records, this clean almost always settled, because the alternative was a courtroom where a judge reads a grandmother's handwriting aloud. He ran the strongest scenario on his legal pad. Nearly $87,000 in a standard index fund over 11 years, at historical average returns. The figure came out right around $142,000. I looked at it and nearly laughed. $142,000. The exact amount my mother had poured into the wedding. The symmetry was so perfect it felt staged. It wasn't. It was just math. Numbers don't bargain and they don't forgive. I told Marcus to draft the demand letter. He said he'd have it done by Friday. I drove home and sat in my driveway a long while with the engine off. A neighbor was watering her flower beds and waving at the mail carrier. An ordinary afternoon. And I just set a lawsuit against my own parents in motion. That is not an ordinary afternoon. I want to be honest about how it felt. I didn't feel righteous. I didn't feel strong. I felt tired. The particular kind of tired that comes from managing for 11 straight years and then realizing that managing had never been some admirable trait of mine. It was a verdict handed to me by people who found it convenient. I thought about my mother at that kitchen table, the color-coded tabs, the way she never once lifted her eyes. You'll figure it out. It had never been a vote of confidence. It was a line item, I was the expense that got cut so another expense could have imported flowers. I didn't feel guilty. Guilt was the thing they'd been handing me free of charge for years. Guilt for needing help. Guilt for asking. Guilt for having a body that required repair while my sister's body required a celebration. What I felt in that driveway was clarity, the kind that arrives the day you quit being the easy one and start being the accurate one. I went inside, poured a glass of water, opened the cedar box one last time, ran a finger down Nana's blue ink and closed it. Friday was 3 days off. Friday came. The demand letter went out. And before the mail could even deliver it, my mother called to invite me to dinner. Not a normal dinner. A big one, aunts and uncles and cousins, the kind she stages when she wants an audience. She said the family was pulling together Sunday for Danielle, that Danielle had been through so much and everyone wanted to show support. I knew this move. I'd watched her run it before. A gathering dressed up as warmth but built to work like a courtroom. Everyone would arrive briefed. Everyone would know Nora had money and Danielle needed rescuing. The food would come out, the small talk would fade, and then my mother or Aunt Janet would make the ask right out in the open. 14 faces turned my way, waiting to see whether I'd be the good sister or the selfish one. I said I'd come. My mother sounded relieved and asked me to bring a dessert. I hung up and pictured the table. My parents at the ends, Danielle looking fragile, Janet looking righteous, Uncle Gary and Cousin Rachel with her husband. Maybe Great-Aunt Ruth, who always takes the side of whoever weeps first. 14 people arranged to squeeze the one person in the room who understood what $142,000 actually was. They thought I was showing up to say yes. They figured the daughter who managed would manage one more thing, write the check, eat the cost, lock in her role as the family's cash machine. They didn't know about the bank records. They didn't know a demand letter was already in the mail. They didn't know I'd be walking in with the cedar box. Saturday afternoon, I drove out to Danielle's place, a rental in Greenwood that smelled like carpet cleaner and worry. I didn't call first. I knocked. Lily opened the door. 13, tall for it, my sister's cheekbones, none of her rehearsed poise. She looked thrown to see me. We'd never been close. I was the aunt who mailed birthday checks and turned up at Christmas with a book. She said, "Hey, Aunt Nora." I asked if her mom was home. Danielle was stretched out on the couch with an ice pack against her neck. She sat up too quickly and flinched, and for a second she looked exactly like I had at 26, guarded, aching, faking that she wasn't. What I felt wasn't pity so much as recognition. Pain wears the same face on everybody. It doesn't care who deserves it. I told Danielle I'd stopped by to check on how Lily was handling everything. That part was true. I sat with Lily at the kitchen table for 20 minutes while her mom rested. She told me about a science project, a study of how bridges carry weight. She liked math. I didn't say a word about the lawsuit or the account. I told her that whatever was happening between the grown-ups in this family, she was not part of it and never would be. She nodded like she already understood more than a kid her age should have to. I left, sat in my car, and made myself a quiet promise. No matter what blew up at that table the next day, no matter what came out of the letter or the suit, Lily would stay protected. The cycle ends when somebody decides it ends. Saturday, 11 at night, my phone lit up. "Mom." I answered because if I didn't she'd try 7 more times. She said she wanted to be sure I was coming. I told her I was. "Good," she said, because I had no idea what my sister was dealing with, the bills, the house, Kevin just disappearing, Danielle alone with Lily and her neck the way it was. I said I knew. "Then you understand why the family has to come together," she said. "This is what family does. After everything we gave you. After everything we gave you." I held the phone to my ear and let that hang there against 11 years of what she'd actually given me. A lie about an empty account. A brace I wore to a wedding my own spine paid for. And you'll figure it out, dressed up as Faith and meant as a shove out the door. I told her I'd be there at 5. She asked me to bring the peach cobbler, the one Nana used to make. She said it with a straight face. She wanted me to carry Nana's recipe into a dinner built to spend Nana's money a second time. So I made the cobbler. I used Nana's recipe card, the one with flour smudges and a grease stain in the corner from decades back. I baked it in Nana's dish. And while it cooled, I packed the cedar box into my bag, the leather ledger, the account agreement, and a copy of the bank statements printed on my firm's letterhead, marked up in my own hand with red pen. Every withdrawal date circled, every matching wedding invoice noted in the margin. I didn't practice a speech. Numbers don't need one. They just need someone willing to read them out loud. Sunday, 5 o'clock, my parents' driveway was full. Uncle Gary's truck, Aunt Janet's sedan, Cousin Rachel's minivan. I parked on the street, carried the cobbler in one hand and the bag with the cedar box in the other. I stood on the porch a second and listened. Laughter ice clinking, my mother's voice pitched high, telling somebody where to put the extra chairs. Through the front window I could see the dining table stretched out with both leaves in, 14 settings, the good china, the set that only appears when she wants to stage something. I walked in. There she is, Aunt Janet cried, arms open, perfume arriving 3 feet ahead of her. She hugged me like I'd just come home from a war. Uncle Gary shook my hand. Rachel squeezed my arm with a look that said she'd been fully briefed and was already on Team Danielle. My father stood in the kitchen doorway with a beer and gave me a nod that held nothing at all. Danielle was already at the table, a soft neck brace showing above her collar, not the rigid kind I'd worn but visible. Real or staged, it was there. My mother came out with serving dishes. She spotted the cobbler first. "Oh, you made Nana's." Then she saw me set my bag on the chair beside mine and something flickered over her face, too quick to name, like watching someone bring a briefcase to a birthday party. Behind the table, the wedding photo in its silver frame, peonies crowning the happy couple, $142,000 of frozen joy. I sat down. The cedar box waited at my feet. Dinner was pot roast. My mother carved. The talk circled Danielle the way water circles a drain, every subject bending her direction. How brutal the divorce had been, how brave she was for Lily, how the house was underwater, how the surgery couldn't be put off. Janet steered it, and she was smooth, the offhand comment, the loaded pause, the "I just believe" family should show up for each other tossed out like a small grenade. By the time the cobbler came out, the table was fully primed. Janet set down her fork. "Nora, we all know why we're really here." The room went still. 14 sets of eyes. My father stared at his plate. "Your sister needs surgery," Janet said, "the kind you of all people know something about." Nice touch, turning my own history into a lever. "The consultation alone runs $3,000, she went on, "and the procedure, if Danielle can even find a surgeon who'll take payments." She let it trail off and looked at Danielle. Danielle looked at me, eyes wet. Whether that was pain or performance, I honestly can't tell you. "Nora," my mother said in her serious voice, "the parent-teacher conference one that means here's the part where you agree. Your sister needs surgery now. Please, you have to help her." The exact words from the phone call. The same rise and fall, probably rehearsed at this very table. I could feel the expectation pressing down. Gary was nodding. Rachel had her hands folded like she was at church. Great-Aunt Ruth was already reaching for a tissue. My mother waited. Danielle waited. Janet waited. All of them waited for the daughter who manages to manage one more thing. I reached down and lifted the bag onto the table. I set the cedar box beside my plate. The brass latch clicked twice. My mother's face changed. She knew it, Nana's box, the one from the hall closet, the one she must have assumed was buried up in that attic for good. "What is that?" Janet asked. I opened it and took out the leather ledger. I set it down, turned to the final page of entries, Nana's careful blue writing, 7 years of deposits, the running total, and at the bottom the line for Nora, "Numbers don't lie." Then I pulled out the account agreement and laid it beside the ledger. "This is the custodial account Nana opened for me," I said. "Under the transfer to minors law, every dollar in it belonged to me. Mom and Dad were only the custodians." Nobody spoke. My father set down his beer. "Nora," my mother started. I took out the bank statements, 8 pages on my firm's letterhead, and laid them next to the agreement. "When I was 26 and needed spinal surgery," I said, "I asked you to release these funds. You told me the account was nearly empty. You told me it went to my schooling. I tapped the pages. On the day I asked, the account held $86,900. It was drained over 6 months. I set the wedding invitation down last, the same one Danielle had mailed to 165 guests. Every withdrawal names a payee, I said. The barn venue, the florist, the caterer, the boutique. Every vendor on this invitation matches a payee on these statements. The withdrawal dates match the payment dates. This account, the one Nana filled for 7 years, paid for this wedding. I looked at the photo on the wall, the peonies, the chandelier, the silver frame. Then I looked at my mother. Danielle needed it more than I did. Her own line handed back with receipts. The room didn't breathe. Janet recovered first. Now hold on, I'm sure there's an explanation. There is, I said. It's breach of fiduciary duty and conversion. That's the legal language for a custodian spending a minor's irrevocable funds on somebody else's wedding. I kept my voice flat. This was a findings presentation, not a fight. I've hired an attorney. A formal demand for repayment went to this address on Friday. Under the statute, we expect I'm owed the principal plus the growth those funds would have earned if they'd stayed invested. And custodians with a paper trail like this almost always settle. I let it breathe. The attorney's estimate, based on standard index returns over 11 years, comes to about $142,000. Gary leaned back. Rachel put a hand over her mouth. Ruth lowered her tissue. 142,000. The number this family had celebrated. The number in the silver frame. The number that bought peonies and duck confit and a quartet while I slept upright because I couldn't lie down. Now it was just a debt. That money belongs to me, I said. It always did. Nana deposited it. Nana recorded it. The bank logged it, and my parents spent it. Not on my schooling, not on my medical care, not on anything the law lets a custodian touch. They spent it on a party. I looked at my father. He was gripping the table edge with both hands. I looked at Danielle. She was staring at the statements like she'd never seen her own wedding itemized. I looked at my mother. She hadn't moved, then she did. She shot up so fast her chair scraped and knocked against the wall. How dare you? Her voice cracked on the second word. How dare you sit in this house at this table and accuse me? I'm not accusing you, I said. The statements are. I'm just reading them. Your grandmother would be ashamed of you. I kept my hands flat and steady. Nana wrote for Nora. Numbers don't lie, I said. I think she knew exactly who'd end up ashamed. My mother's face folded into something new. Not grief, not regret, closer to being caught. She started to cry, but it was the crying I'd watched her do at return counters and insurance desks, the kind engineered to pull the room's sympathy back to her. I did what I had to for this family, she said. Your grandmother left that money for the family, not just for you. It was a custodial account, I said. My name, my funds. That's not a reading of it, it's the law. You always had to be so smart, she said, so righteous. Danielle stood. Are you kidding me right now? I'm sitting here with a broken neck and you're suing Mom over money. You're punishing me. I'm not punishing you, I said. I'm recovering what's mine. Janet jumped in with something about family and forgiveness and how money isn't everything, and I let her finish because nothing she said moved a single number. Then my father spoke. He hadn't looked up since I set the statements down. I should have said something. The room went quiet again. He stared at his hands. I knew I should have told you. He paused. But Nora, can't you just let this go for the family? I studied him a long moment. The same face from that Sunday in May 11 years back, holding the iced tea, watching the floor, walking off to the garage. My mother steadied herself on the chair back. She pulled in a breath I could hear across the table. Then she played her last card. But your sister needs surgery now. Same words, same rhythm, same plea, spoken this time to a room full of people who finally understood what those words had cost me the last time. I looked at Danielle, at the soft brace, at the florist's invoice sitting 2 inches from her water glass. I looked at my mother, the woman who told me to manage while she spent my future on someone else's weekend. I looked at the photo on the wall, the chandelier, the frame, the guests and the imported flowers and the custom dress, all of it paid for with money my grandmother had set aside one deposit at a time in a ledger with a cracked spine. I felt the rods in my back. I felt 11 years of managing. I looked my mother in the eye and I said it the way she'd once said it to me, even and matter of fact, no cruelty in it, just describing how things go. She'll figure it out. I left before the cobbler was finished. Nobody walked me to my car. The lawsuit settled 3 months later. Their attorney told them to stay out of court. The documentation was too thorough, the breach too plain. The settlement returned $138,000 plus attorney's fees. Not quite the full 142, but close enough that the math felt honest. My parents refinanced the house to cover it. I don't take pleasure in that. I take accuracy. Danielle found a surgeon who accepted a payment plan through a hospital assistance program. She had the operation in August and was back on her feet by Thanksgiving. She figured it out. She figured it out the way I once did, slowly, painfully, with nobody writing a check to smooth the road. The difference is nobody robbed her to fund somebody else's comfort. She just had to do it the hard way, same as me. The money that came back went 3 directions. Part of it into a custodial account in Lily's name, with me as custodian and a letter attached spelling out exactly what it is, exactly how much sits in it, and exactly when it becomes hers. Part of it to a fund that covers surgical costs for uninsured patients here in Indiana. And the rest back into my firm because the firm is mine, and every bit of it I built while sleeping in a recliner. My father calls about twice a year now. The conversations are shorter. My mother doesn't call. Danielle sent one text in December. No ask, no demand, just 2 lines. I didn't know where the money came from. I'm sorry, I haven't answered yet. I'm still deciding what it's worth. I see Lily once a month. We sit at her kitchen table and she walks me through her homework, mostly math, which she's good at. I don't coach her. I just check her work and let her explain how she got there. Last week she asked if I was angry at her mom. I told her the truth. I'm not angry, I'm clear. Those are different things. I stood up from her table and felt the rods settle in my lower back the way they always do. A small shift, a quiet reminder. The scars faded to a pale line now. The brace is buried in a landfill somewhere. The cedar box sits on my desk at the office, next to my monitor where I can see it while I work. I open it sometimes, not for the documents. Those are filed, but for the ledger, for Nana's steady blue ink saying the same thing on every page. I was here. I counted. And what I counted for you.